The afternoon light was doing what it always did in late October in the hill country, turning everything amber and forgiving, softening the hard edges of things, making the world look the way people imagine it looked when they were children, before they understood how much of the beauty was just the angle of the light. Vera Calloway sat in the passenger seat of her neighbor's truck and watched it happen to the passing landscape, and thought that she had never in her 83 years on this earth grown tired of it. That was the thing nobody ever told you about being old. The light still moved you. The same light that had moved you at 25, at 40, at 60, still arrived every October afternoon and did exactly what it had always done, and you felt it exactly the way you had always felt it, in the chest, behind the sternum, a quiet ache that was not unpleasant, but was not quite comfortable either. It was the ache of beauty. She had learned a long time ago not to turn away from it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What she was turning away from was the house. Her son Dale's house, to be precise. The large beige colonial on Sycamore Court in the suburb of Millhaven, Texas, with its 3-car garage and its automatic sprinkler system, and its guest bedroom that smelled of plug-in air fresheners, and the particular stale sweetness of a room that was used for storage between visits, and then hastily cleared when she arrived. She had lived in that guest bedroom for 14 months. She had spent 14 months moving through someone else's home with the careful, minimizing steps of a woman who understood she was a guest in the truest sense of the word, which meant welcome within limits she had not set and could not change. It had not been cruel. That was the thing she kept returning to in her more honest moments, sitting at the edge of the guest bed with her hands in her lap, and the plug-in air freshener doing its work in the corner. Dale had not been cruel. His wife Sheila had not been cruel. They had done everything that could reasonably be called correct. They had given her a room. They had included her at dinner 3 or 4 nights a week, though the conversations at those dinners had the quality of conversations between people who had run out of things to say to each other and had agreed to perform the saying of things anyway. They had taken her to her doctor's appointments. They had been patient about the television volume and her early rising and the fact that she sometimes forgot she had already told a story and told it again from the beginning without realizing. Vera Calloway had raised Dale alone after his father left when Dale was 11 years old. She had worked 31 years as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing firm in San Marcos, rising from entry level to the position of senior accounts manager, which was a title that meant she was competent and reliable, and that the firm had come to depend on her in ways they understood well enough to keep her employed through 3 recessions, but not well enough to have ever named out loud. She had put Dale through 2 years of community college and 2 years at a state university, contributing what she could each semester from a salary that did not leave much room for contribution. She had done this without complaint because he was her son and because complaint had never been her method of moving through the world. Her method was to look at what was in front of her, assess it clearly, decide what she could do about it, and do that. She had applied this method to Dale's guest bedroom and the plug-in air fresheners and the careful, minimizing steps. She had assessed the situation with the same clear eyes she had brought to 31 years of accounts management. What she found, when she looked at it honestly, was this. Dale loved her in the specific and limited way of people who have learned to love their parents from a distance and have never quite figured out how to close it. He had built a life that did not have obvious room for her in it. He had a wife and 3 teenage children and a demanding job in pharmaceutical sales and a schedule that moved with the efficiency of a machine that had been calibrated without her in mind. She did not begrudge him any of this. She had wanted him to build a full life. She had worked to give him the means to do it. The fact that the life he had built did not include a natural place for her was not a failure of love so much as a failure of imagination, the inability to picture what it might look like to actually integrate her rather than accommodate her. The conversation had come on a Wednesday. Dale had called it a family meeting, which Vera had always found to be a phrase that announced before anything else was said that someone had already made a decision and was about to present it as a discussion. He and Sheila sat across from her at the kitchen table with the careful positioning of people who had rehearsed their arrangement. Dale had his laptop open. On the screen was a website for a place called Meadow Crest Senior Living, which had photographs of white-haired people doing Tai Chi in what appeared to be a very clean courtyard. "Mom, we've been thinking about this for a while now." He said it the way he said things when he was nervous, quickly, and without his usual deliberate pace, as though speed would move them through the uncomfortable part faster. And we both feel like it might be time to think about it more. He paused here, and Vera watched him select the word with the care of someone choosing a tool for a delicate job, a more structured living situation. She had looked at the laptop screen. The Tai Chi people were smiling. In the photographs on these websites, they were always smiling. She wondered who arranged their faces that way. Before the photograph was taken, whether someone stood to the side and said smile, or whether the smiling was simply assumed, the way smiling was assumed in all the contexts where someone wanted you to believe that what you were looking at was happiness rather than its performance. What does structured mean? She said. Sheila spoke then with the practiced warmth she brought to difficult conversations, a warmth that was real enough in its way, but that had always reminded Vera of the warmth of a waiting room, comfortable and neutral and designed for temporary occupation. It means consistent support, Vera. Daily activities. Medical staff on site. People your own age to spend time with. I spend time with people my own age, Vera said. Ruth Evander comes twice a week. We play cards. Dale looked at his laptop screen. Meadow Crest has a bridge club. Vera looked at her son. She looked at him the way she had always looked at him when she wanted him to understand something that was not going to be said directly. The way she had looked at him when he was 16 and had told her he was fine in the specific tone that meant he was not fine but was not yet ready to say so. The way she had looked at him when he was 34 and had called from a business trip sounding hollow, and she had understood before he said a word that the marriage was in trouble. Dale did not meet her eyes. He looked at the laptop. That was when she said it. She said it quietly and without drama, the way she had always said the things that mattered. She said, "What about your grandmother's place?" The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room in which something has been said that everyone had been pretending wasn't there. Dale's mother's mother, Estelle Calloway, had owned 47 acres of land outside a small town called Granger, Texas, an hour and 20 minutes northeast of Austin. Estelle had bought the land in 1958 with money saved from a decade of work as a seamstress and a part-time postal clerk. She had built a house on it, a simple stone and cedar house with a wide front porch and a root cellar and a workshop attached to the east side, where she had spent most of her evenings doing work that Vera had never fully understood as a child, but had understood better as she grew older. Methodical work, careful work, work done with the patience of a woman who believed that most things worth doing required more time than people were generally willing to give them. Estelle had died in 2001. She had left the land to Vera, her only child, with the specific instruction written into the will in Estelle's own clear hand that the land was not to be sold. The property had sat empty for 22 years. Vera had meant to do something with it, had told herself every year that this would be the year she drove out and assessed it properly and decided what it ought to become. She had not done it. Life had moved the way life moves, and the years had accumulated quietly around the intention without it ever becoming action. And now the land sat out there east of Granger with a house that was probably in some state of ruin after more than 2 decades of vacancy and nobody who had touched it in all that time. Dale stared at her. "Mom, that place has been sitting empty for over 20 years. Which is exactly why," Vera said, "it hasn't cost me anything. You can't be serious about going out there." Sheila said it carefully, the same careful warmth, not unkind, simply certain in the way of people who are certain and have stopped examining the certainty. That property has no electricity, no working plumbing. We don't even know what condition the structure is in. You're 83 years old. Vera set her hands flat on the kitchen table. It was a gesture she had developed over a long professional life, the gesture of a woman settling into something she had decided. "I'm 83, she said, "not incapacitated. There's a difference, and I need both of you to understand that I understand that difference even if you've stopped being able to." Dale opened his mouth. She continued, "Your grandmother left me that land because she understood something that I should have understood sooner and that I am choosing to understand now. She left it to me because she knew there would come a time when I would need a place that was entirely mine. A place where I was not a guest, and not a responsibility, and not a situation to be managed." She set her jaw. "I'm going to Granger." Dale had driven her. She had not asked him to, but he had appeared at the guest room door on Saturday morning with his keys in his hand, and said he was going with her, and she had not argued because she could see on his face that his reasons for coming were at least partly real, that somewhere beneath the guilt and the practicality was a son who was not entirely comfortable with how the week had gone. The drive had been quiet in the productive way of silences between people who have said the things that needed saying and are now moving through the space those words have left. Dale drove, and Vera watched the landscape change through the passenger window, the suburbs giving way to commuter towns, and then to the open rolling country east of Austin, where the land stretched wide and the sky took up more of the world than it did in cities. She thought about her mother. Estelle Calloway had been the most self-contained person Vera had ever known. Not cold, not distant, but complete in herself in a way that Vera had spent most of her life trying to understand and had perhaps only recently begun to. Estelle had needed very little from the external world because she had built an interior life of extraordinary richness, and the 47 acres outside Granger had been the physical expression of that interior life, the place where it could unfold without interference or apology. What had Estelle done out there? Vera had been 12 when the land was purchased and 16 when the house was built, and had spent summers there through her teenage years, enough to have impressions, but not enough to have understanding. She remembered the workshop. She remembered that it was always locked with a heavy padlock that Estelle kept on a key ring on her belt loop, that entering it required Estelle's explicit permission, and that Estelle granted this permission rarely and always accompanied. She remembered the smell of the workshop, dry and complex, and unlike anything else she had encountered before or since. She remembered rows of jars on wooden shelves. She remembered notebooks stacked with a neatness that had seemed, to her teenage self, excessive. She had not been inside the workshop since the summer before she left for college. She had not been inside it the last 2 times she had visited the property while Estelle was alive, because Estelle in her final years had stopped going into the workshop herself, had referred to it obliquely as finished, and Vera had understood this word to mean something more than just completed, but had not pressed for a clearer definition because Estelle was not a woman you pressed. The workshop had a lock. It had always had a lock. Vera had the key. She had found it in the zippered compartment of her travel bag 6 months ago while looking for her reading glasses. She had no memory of putting it there. She had no clear memory of when she had received it or from whom, though the most logical explanation was that it had been given to her at the time of Estelle's death, along with the deed and the will and the other practical papers that had passed to Vera after the funeral. She had kept the key without knowing why she was keeping it, carrying it in her travel bag for 6 months the way you sometimes carry things whose purpose has not yet revealed itself. The gravel road that turned off the main county route and wound half a mile through cedar and live oak to the property was as she had imagined it, which was to say deeply overgrown on both sides and significantly deteriorated in its surface, the gravel long since scattered by rain and time until the road was more suggestion than fact. Dale's truck moved over it slowly with the careful uncertainty of a vehicle being asked to do something its driver was not confident it could do. At the end of the road, the house came into view in pieces. First, the rusted roofline visible above the tree lean, then the cedar plank walls dark with age and vine, then the full structure at once, small and gray, and consumed in the particular way of things that have been given back to the landscape after years of being withheld from it. Dale said nothing. He sat with his hands still on the steering wheel after he had put the truck in park, and he looked at the house, and he did not try to fill the silence with his reaction. Vera opened the door and stepped out into the October afternoon, and the first thing she noticed was the smell, the good dry cedar smell of the hill country in autumn, the smell of living things going dormant for winter without giving up, storing energy in their roots against the cold. She stood at the edge of what had once been a cleared yard and looked at her mother's house. It was in worse shape than she had expected, which she had expected. The front porch had entirely collapsed on its right side, the support beams giving way to 2 decades of moisture and termites until the whole right half of the porch structure had subsided onto the ground at a gradual angle, like something setting down a heavy weight it had carried for too long. The windows on the ground floor were intact, but so filmed with algae and decades of grime as to be entirely opaque. Vines had made serious work of the north wall, climbing from foundation to roofline in thick, braided ropes of green that had pulled loose the old chinking between the cedar planks in several places. The chimney was standing. She noted that. The chimney was upright and appeared solid, which told her something about the interior walls that she found reassuring. She walked to the front door. The door was a heavy cedar plank door that Estelle had made herself, or had made with help. In the first years on the property, a door designed to last, fitted with iron hinges that had gone to rust in the corners but had not let go. There was a deadbolt lock below the handle. Vera took out her keys and found the house key, which she had carried on her main ring all this time without losing it, and she worked the lock, which resisted for several turns before the bolt gave way with the sound of old metal agreeing to move one more time. The door swung inward. The smell that came out was the smell of 2 decades of sealed space, the accumulated stillness of air that has had nothing to move it for a very long time, dust and old wood, and the dry must of a house that was cold in winter and hot in summer and had held both without complaint and was now releasing the record of all those seasons in one long-held exhale. Vera stood in the doorway and breathed it in. Dale had come up behind her. He stood at her shoulder looking into the dim interior. "Mom," he said quietly. She stepped inside. The front room was larger than she had remembered it, or perhaps memory had compressed it over the years in the way memory compresses spaces once they stop being used. The plank floor was thick with dust and the desiccated remains of insects and the occasional small animal skeleton, a mouse, something else she didn't examine closely. The furniture was still here, still arranged as Estelle had arranged it. 2 chairs and a small table near the fireplace, a longer wooden bench along the west wall. Everything was coated in the same even layer of gray that covered every surface in the room, the same patient accumulation. Dust did not hurry. It arrived steadily over years, and it did not discriminate. The fireplace was solid stone. She ran her hand along the mantel, which was a single slab of cedar, dried and darkened with age but intact. The hearth was clean, or as clean as anything in this room could be called. The ash from the last fire Estelle had built here long since settled and cool. She moved through the house slowly and with deliberate attention. The kitchen at the back, which still held the cast iron stove Estelle had used for 40 years, and the long wooden work table along the south wall, and the deep farmhouse sink that Vera remembered sitting at the edge of as a very small child, swinging her legs, watching her mother work. The back bedroom with its iron bed frame still in place, the mattress long since collapsed on its springs and useful for nothing, but the frame solid. The narrow stair to the loft above the kitchen, steep as it had always been, which she climbed carefully, one hand on the railing and one hand on the wall, finding the loft intact under its lower ceiling with the single window that faced east and which was not filmed in algae because the cedar of the eaves had sheltered it from the worst of the weather and it still let in light. She came back downstairs and went outside, walking around the perimeter of the house in the long grass, making her assessment. The foundation was stone and appeared sound. The roofline had sagged in one section above the kitchen, and she would need someone qualified to look at it before the first rain, but the rest of it appeared to be holding. The collapsed porch could be rebuilt. The plumbing would have to be addressed entirely. The electrical, she was certain, was not safe to use. But the bones were here. Estelle had built to last, and the house had lasted, imperfectly, unevenly, carrying its damage with the stoic honesty of structures that were made to endure. On the east side of the house, attached at the back corner, was the workshop. It was smaller than she had remembered, or perhaps her memory had inflated it with the importance her child self had assigned to the locked, mysterious space where her mother did her particular and private work. The walls were the same cedar plank as the house. The roof appeared intact. The heavy padlock on the door was in the same place it had always been, a large iron padlock on an iron hasp, and it was the deep reddish brown of iron that has been rained on and dried and rained on again for decades without being oiled or attended to. Vera stood in front of the workshop door and looked at the padlock. She reached into her coat pocket. She had moved the key there at some point during the drive, from the zippered compartment of her travel bag to her pocket, without quite acknowledging she was doing it. The key was iron, old, heavier than it looked, with the particular weight of things made in a time when things were made to outlast their makers. She looked at the key in her palm. She looked at the padlock. Dale was behind her. She could hear him in the grass, making the sounds of a man standing nearby not quite knowing what to do with himself. She was not ready to open it. She recognized this clearly, without self-judgment. She was not ready for whatever was in there. She would open it when she was ready, and she would not open it before, and the difference between these two things was everything. That was not age. That was not weakness. That was the particular intelligence of a woman who had learned over 83 years that some doors deserved to be opened at the right time or not at all. She put the key back in her pocket. She turned around and looked at Dale. I need a contractor, she said. Someone who knows old buildings. And I'm going to need help finding a source for water until the plumbing is assessed. And I need to know if there's a hardware store in Granger or if I'm going to tailor for supplies. Dale looked at her. He had the expression of a man standing at the edge of something he had not anticipated. Mom, he started. I'm staying, she said. Not as a question. Not as a negotiation. As information. I'm staying, Dale. I'd like your help getting started, but I don't need it. I need you to understand that I don't need it. He looked at his truck. He looked at the collapsed porch and the vined walls and the film of grime on the windows and the wild grass pressing in from every direction. There's a hardware store in Granger, he said finally. I know because I looked it up on the way here. She felt something move through her that she recognized as love. Not the simple love of approval or warmth, but the complicated love of a woman who has raised a person through the full, difficult arc of becoming, who knows that person's limits and capacities both, and chooses them anyway. She looked at her son, standing in the tall grass beside his grandmother's overgrown workshop with his car keys still in his hand, and she chose him. Good, she said. We'll start there. They drove into Granger in the amber light of the October afternoon, and Vera Calloway made her first list on the back of a gas station receipt, with a pen she borrowed from Dale and did not give back. The list had 11 items. She started with the ones she could reach from where she was. That had always been enough to begin. The hardware store in Granger was called Pruitt's, and it had been on the same corner of Main Street since 1947, which Vera knew because the year was painted in faded block letters above the door alongside the store's name. The kind of quiet declaration of longevity that small-town businesses made without fanfare and without apology. Inside it smelled of motor oil and cut lumber and the particular metallic sweetness of new tools still in their packaging, and a man behind the counter named Hector, who appeared to be somewhere in his late 60s and had the sun-darkened hands of someone who had spent the better part of his life working outside before ending up on the inside of a counter, looked up when they entered and said, "Afternoon," with the tone of a man who meant it. Vera set her list on the counter. She had transferred it from the gas station receipt to a proper sheet of notepaper during the drive, organizing it by category the way she had always organized things. The most urgent items at the top, the items that required outside help flagged with a small mark in the margin, the items she could address herself left unmarked. She was a bookkeeper's daughter as much as she was a bookkeeper, and her mother had raised her to believe that the quality of a list told you almost everything you needed to know about the quality of the mind that made it. Hector read it without comment. He read it the way experienced people read lists, not linearly, but in a kind of rapid assessment, taking in the whole before returning to the specific. Then he looked up at her. The Calloway property? He said. She looked at him. You know it. Everybody in Granger knows it, he said. Or knew of Miss Estelle, anyway. He paused with the careful consideration of someone deciding how much history to offer a stranger. Your relation? Her daughter, Vera said. He nodded slowly. She passed some years back. 22 years, Vera said. The land's been sitting. He looked back at the list. He tapped the third item, the one she had flagged with a margin mark. Structural assessment, roof. He said, I know a man. Name's Carol Briggs. Does old stone and cedar work. Been doing it his whole life. He's who you want for that property. He'll tell you the truth of it, which some people don't want to hear, but which you strike me as someone who does. Vera said, You strike me correctly. Hector almost smiled. He spent 45 minutes with them, walking them through the store to each thing on the list, making substitutions when he knew of better options, flagging 2 items as things he'd need to order in if she wanted the quality worth having, writing Carol Briggs' phone number on a card from a small wooden box beside the register. Dale carried the supplies. Vera paid with the unhurried precision of someone who has been managing accounts for decades and whose relationship with money was neither anxious nor casual, but simply accurate. In the truck on the way back to the property, Dale said, You know Carol Briggs might come out and tell you the roof needs full replacement. I know, Vera said. That could be significant cost. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. Then, how much do you actually have, Mom? In savings. She told him. The number was not extravagant. It was the accumulated result of 31 years of careful living, of a woman who had never spent money on things she didn't need and had saved what the budget allowed and had invested it conservatively because she understood the difference between careful growth and gambling. even when the gambling was called something that sounded more respectable. It was enough to begin. She was not certain it was enough to finish, but finishing was a problem that belonged to the future, and the future had a way of presenting its own solutions when you met it honestly. Dale heard the number and did not say what she could tell he was thinking. She appreciated that. They drove back to the property in the amber light that was now going orange at its edges as the sun moved toward the Cedar Ridge in the west, and Vera Calloway stepped out of the truck and looked at her mother's house and felt, with a clarity that surprised her in its simplicity, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not happy. Not yet. The work ahead was too substantial for happiness to be the right word. But right. The particular rightness of having made the correct decision and being willing to live inside the consequences of it. She slept that first night in her sleeping bag on the wooden bench in the front room, which was not comfortable but was adequate, and she had always understood adequate as a starting point rather than a destination. She had brought a camping lantern and a small propane stove and enough food for 3 days. She had brought her reading glasses and 3 books and the zippered travel bag with the workshop key still in its pocket. She had brought the photograph of her mother that she had kept on her desk for 40 years, Estelle in her late 50s standing at the edge of her garden in the morning light, looking not at the camera, but at something to the left of it with the expression of a woman who has just thought of something important and is filing it carefully away. Vera propped the photograph against the stone mantel of the fireplace. She lit a small fire from the wood Dale had helped her stack before he drove back to Millhaven, extracting a promise from her that she would call him every morning, a promise she gave because she intended to keep it and because making it seemed to be what he needed in order to drive away without turning back. She sat in one of Estelle's chairs in the firelight and looked at her mother's face in the photograph and thought about the workshop. 22 years. The padlock had sat in rain and sun and cold and heat for 22 years and had not given way. Whatever was inside had been sealed for longer than that, sealed by her mother's deliberate act, kept behind a lock to which Vera had been given the key. Given it and not told anything about what waited on the other side, or perhaps told everything in the way of the giving itself, which was to say, here is the key and the rest is yours to find. She was not ready yet. She had established this clearly in her own mind when she had stood at the workshop door in the afternoon with the key in her palm. But she was aware of it in the way you are aware of a room you have decided to enter when the time is right, aware of its presence behind the wall, aware of the gravity of it. The workshop exerted something on her even from inside the house. She could feel its weight through the stone and cedar of the east wall. She went to sleep with the fire burning low and the photograph of her mother on the mantel and the workshop's padlocked silence on the other side of the wall. Carol. Briggs arrived on Tuesday morning in a truck that was older than Dale's but better maintained, with a toolbox in the bed and the kind of unhurried confidence of a man who had been assessing buildings for long enough that buildings had stopped surprising him. He was in his early 70s, Vera estimated, with a methodical quality that she recognized and respected. He shook her hand with a grip that was firm without performing its firmness and said, "Let me look at it," and spent the next 2 hours doing exactly that, moving around the exterior of the house with a professional patience, pressing on foundation stones, examining the collapsed porch structure, running his hand along the roofline where he could reach it, going up into the loft with a flashlight to examine the underside of the roof from the interior. When he came down from the loft, he sat at the kitchen work table across from Vera and told her what he had found. He told it to her plainly, without the softening of bad news that some contractors performed for clients they assumed could not handle accuracy, which she found correct and appreciated. The roof needed partial replacement above the kitchen section, he said. The rest of it was sound. The porch needed to come down entirely and be rebuilt. The damage was too extensive for repair to be economical. The foundation was solid. Estelle had built it in the old way with good stone and good mortar, and it would outlast all of them. The plumbing would need a full assessment by a plumber, but based on the age and the condition of the house, he expected the pipes to be corroded through and replacement to be necessary. Same for the electrical, which was original and should not be used until a licensed electrician had gone through it entirely. He gave her a number for his portion of the work. It was a reasonable number. She could see that immediately. The number of a man who had decided to charge what the work was worth rather than what the situation might allow him to charge. She said she would like him to begin the following Monday if he was available. He said he was. Before he left, she showed him the workshop. She walked him around the exterior of it and asked him to look at the structure and tell her what he thought. He examined it with the same methodical care he had given the house, pressing on the cedar planks, checking the roofline, looking at the hasp and the padlock with a brief professional attention. "This part of the building is in better shape than the house," he said. "The overhang on the roof is deeper, kept the walls drier." He indicated the padlock. "That lock has been there a good while. Since at least the 1960s, Vera said. He nodded. "You have the key?" "I have it." He looked at the door. "Whatever's in there's been sealed up, good and proper." His voice carried no pressure in either direction. No encouragement, no discouragement. Just the statement of fact that it was sealed and she had the key. She nodded. "Not yet," she said. He accepted this without comment. "Some things wait better than others," he said, and went to his truck. The second week brought Ruth Dempsey. Ruth was 64 years old and lived on the adjacent property, a quarter-mile up the road through the cedar, in a house she had built with her late husband 20 years ago and maintained alone since his death 3 years prior. She arrived on Vera's 8th day at the property in a pickup truck of her own with a covered dish balanced on the passenger seat, which she carried up the cleared path to the front door with the directness of someone who has decided to do something and is doing it without ceremony. "My name is Ruth Dempsey," she said when Vera opened the door. "I am your closest neighbor, and I have been watching that driveway for a week waiting for a reasonable moment to come by. This casserole has chicken in it. I hope that's all right." Vera stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. Ruth came in and looked at the front room with the assessing eye of a woman who had done her own work on her own house and understood what she was looking at. "Carol's been out," she said, more as observation than question, noting the marked areas on the porch with the contractor's tape. "Monday," Vera said. "He's starting Monday." "Good man," Ruth said. She set the casserole on the kitchen work table and looked around the kitchen with the same direct attention. She looked at the cast-iron stove and the farmhouse sink and the long work table and the photograph of Estelle propped on the mantel in the front room, visible through the doorway. She said, "That's Miss Estelle." "My mother," Vera said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I moved out here in 1999. Miss Estelle was still here then, just barely. She came over once, my first autumn on this road. Brought me a jar of something she had made, preserves or a tincture, I wasn't entirely sure which, labeled in her own handwriting. I still have the jar. Never could bring myself to use what was in it or throw it away." Vera looked at her. "What was in it?" Ruth shook her head. "I don't know. The label said something botanical that I didn't recognize and a date, 1998. She paused. "Your mother was a very particular woman. Particular in the good way, the way of people who know exactly what they're doing and don't feel the need to explain it at length." "No," Vera said. She never explained things at length. They ate the casserole at the kitchen work table and talked for 2 hours in the way of women who are past the age of requiring a long runway before genuine conversation becomes possible. Ruth told her about the road and the property and the nearest town and who in Granger was worth knowing. Vera told her about Dale and Sheila and the Meadow Crest brochures with the Tai Chi photographs and the 14 months in the guest bedroom. Ruth listened with the particular quality of a listener who does not rush to fill the space after something difficult has been said. "You made the right call," Ruth said when Vera had finished. "Not because the other option was wrong exactly, but because you knew yourself well enough to know what you needed, and there's a specific kind of courage in that which most people don't give themselves credit for." Vera thought about that for a moment. "Or stubbornness," she said. Ruth smiled. "Those are often the same thing dressed differently." Carol and his crew arrived Monday morning, and the sound of the property changed entirely. The quiet of 2 weeks replaced by the productive noise of work being done with purpose and competence. They took down the collapsed porch structure first, removing the damaged wood with the careful thoroughness of people who understood that the house behind it was not to be damaged further in the process, sorting the timber into what could be salvaged and what could not. They began the roof replacement above the kitchen, working in the cool October mornings, the sound of their hammers coming to Vera wherever she was on the property with the satisfying rhythm of progress being made. She worked alongside their work and around it. She had established her own routines with the deliberateness of someone who understands that routines are how difficult things get done, not through grand effort, but through the accumulation of consistent smaller efforts over time. She rose at first light and made coffee on the propane stove and walked the property for 30 minutes in the early morning quiet, learning it the way you learn a place that has been waiting for you, slowly and with full attention. She cleared brush from around the house in the mornings, working methodically outward from the foundation, cutting back the vines that had taken the north wall and the cedar saplings that had seeded themselves everywhere with the particular ambition of cedar trees given 22 years of uncontested growing. She sorted what she cleared into piles, the good wood for the fire, the brush for the burn pile Carol had told her was acceptable to burn on still days. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Her body offered its opinions about this work every evening with the consistency of a critic who has found a reliable subject. Her lower back communicated clearly and at length. Her hands, despite the gloves she wore, developed blisters that became calluses in the first 2 weeks, the skin thickening in the way it does when it is asked to do more than it has recently been asked to do. She rested when she needed to rest, sitting on the up-hinded bucket she kept near the work site and drinking water from the jug she refilled at the utility spigot Carol had gotten running in the second week. And she did not allow herself to feel guilty about the resting because guilt about rest was a luxury of people who had not yet understood that the work did not require martyrdom, only persistence. In the evenings, she sat with Estelle's photograph and her own thoughts. She had been thinking about the workshop with a steadiness that she recognized not as obsession but as preparation, the way the mind prepares itself for something it knows it is moving toward even when the body has not yet taken the steps. She had walked past the workshop's locked door every day without stopping. She had looked at it and acknowledged it and moved on. She had done this with the patience of a woman who had learned over 83 years that forcing a thing before it was ready was the surest way to break it. On the evening of her third week at the property, she was sitting in the front room with the fire going and the lantern lit beside her chair when she noticed something she had not noticed before. She had been looking at the east wall, the wall that connected the house to the workshop, and she had noticed a difference in the stonework in the lower left corner of the wall that she had somehow not registered in her previous 3 weeks of moving through the space. The mortar in that section was different from the mortar elsewhere on the wall, not dramatically so, not in a way that announced itself, but different in color and texture in a way that suggested it had been applied at a different time. Newer mortar in a section of old wall. She stood and crossed the room and crouched in front of the section, pressing her palm against it. The stones themselves were the same limestone as the rest of the foundation, but they had been reset at some point, removed and replaced and remortared. She could see it clearly now that she was looking for it, the faint rectangular outline of the reset section, approximately 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, running along the base of the east wall. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. Behind that reset section of wall was, as far as she understood the layout of the house, the interior floor of the workshop, a section of the workshop's floor-level wall that had been opened at some point and then carefully sealed again. Opened from the house side, which meant someone had wanted access between the house and the workshop that did not require going through the locked exterior door. She sat on the floor in front of the east wall for a long time with the fire going behind her and the lantern light steady beside her and the October wind moving through the cedar outside, and she thought about her mother. About the precision of Estelle's habits, about the padlock on the workshop door that had never, in all the years Vera had known it, been left unlocked or left unattended, about the key that Vera had been carrying for 6 months without knowing why, about the reset section of wall with its newer mortar that had been sitting in this room for 22 years waiting for someone to notice it. Her mother had wanted the workshop approached from the outside, through the locked door, with the key. The opening in the wall was something else. A second way in, or a second way out, or simply evidence of something that had been moved at some point, something that had required an opening large enough to pass through at floor level. She pressed her palm against the reset stone again. The mortar was solid. Whatever had been moved through this opening had been moved, and then the opening had been closed and mortared with the intention of it staying closed. She went to bed thinking about it, and woke in the morning still thinking about it, and said nothing to Carol when he arrived, though she watched him while he worked and thought about what she knew of him, which was that he was a man who told the truth of what he found and charged what the work was worth, and she thought that when the time came she might tell him what she had found. She was not ready yet, but she was closer. The call from Dale came on a Thursday evening in her 4th week. He called reliably every few days. the calls lasting longer than the Sunday calls from Gerald's house had ever lasted, which she took as a sign of something, though she wasn't certain what. He asked his practical questions first, the ones about the roof and the plumbing assessment and whether she had enough propane for the stove, and she answered them with the specificity he needed to feel that his worry was being properly attended to. Then he asked the question he always eventually arrived at, the one underneath the practical ones. Are you okay, Mom? Really okay? She sat in Estelle's chair with the fire going and the photograph on the mantel and the east wall with its reset section at the bottom, invisible in the firelight from where she sat, but present in her awareness the way things are present when you have decided to understand them. I'm better than okay, she said. And I mean that accurately, not optimistically. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Sheila asked about you the other day. Whether you'd found the property livable. What did you tell her? He paused. I told her you'd made it a home. He said it carefully, with the specific care of a man who was reporting something honestly that he had not entirely expected to be true. Which was accurate. It is, Vera said. After she hung up, she sat for a long time in the firelight looking at the east wall. The wind had come up outside, moving through the cedar with a low, steady sound like a voice speaking in a language she had not quite learned, and the fire responded to it in small ways, the flames tilting and recovering, the way all things do when the wind finds them. She was ready. She felt it with the same clarity with which she had felt, standing at the workshop door 4 weeks ago, that she was not. The line between those two states was not dramatic. It was simply the line between not yet and now, and she had crossed it somewhere in the evening without marking the precise moment. She took the key from the zippered pocket of her travel bag. She put on her coat. She took the camping lantern and turned it to its fullest brightness. She went out through the back door into the October night with the cedar smell and the wind moving through the trees and the stars very clear and close in the way they were clear and close out here away from city light, and she walked to the workshop door. The padlock was cold under her fingers. She fit the key into it. The lock resisted for a moment with the resistance of a mechanism that had not been operated in decades, the tumblers stiff with age and rust, and the accumulated resistance of 22 years of being asked to do nothing. She applied steady pressure, not force, steady pressure, the way her mother had always approached things that resisted, and the lock turned. The hasp swung free. She pulled it back. She put her hand on the workshop door. The door opened inward. She lifted the lantern and stepped inside. The smell reached her first, exactly as she had remembered it from childhood, dry and herbal and layered in a way that no single plant could account for. The accumulated scent of decades of botanical work in an enclosed space, pressed into the walls and the floor and the wooden shelves and the very air itself, which had been sealed for 22 years, and had preserved the smell with the same faithfulness with which it had preserved everything else. She raised the lantern. The workshop was perhaps 20 feet by 12 feet, with a ceiling that followed the pitch of the roof, and shelving along 3 of the 4 walls from floor to near ceiling, and a long central work table of heavy planked wood that ran most of the length of the room. The shelving held jars, hundreds of them. They were arranged with the precise organizational logic of a person who had spent a lifetime developing systems, grouped by size, and then by some additional criteria that she could not immediately determine, each one sealed with a wax seal over the lid, each one labeled in her mother's handwriting, small and clear and precise. She moved to the nearest shelf and raised the lantern to read the labels. Botanical names she did not recognize, dates going back decades. Small notations beside the names in her mother's hand, the same careful hand that had written everything, receipts, letters, the deed to this property, the note inside the will. On the work table, arranged with the deliberateness of things placed to be found, were 11 notebooks, leather-covered, varying in thickness, stacked in 2 careful piles with a flat stone on top of each to keep them from shifting. And beside the notebooks, laid flat on the table's surface, was an envelope. It had her name on it in her mother's handwriting. Vera. Just Vera. No last name. As though Estelle had known there would be no one else to find it. She stood at the work table with the lantern in one hand and looked at the envelope with her name on it for a long moment. The wind moved outside. The cedar smell of the hill country night came through the gaps in the old walls. The hundreds of sealed jars on their shelves held their patient contents in the lamplight, waiting. She set the lantern on the work table. She picked up the envelope. She broke the wax seal on the back of it, which had held for 22 years without giving way, opened it carefully, and took out the single folded sheet of paper inside. Her mother's handwriting. The date at the top was November 14th, 2000, 14 months before Estelle died. She read it once, standing at the work table in the amber light of the camping lantern, with the sealed jars all around her and the notebooks in their careful stacks and the night wind in the cedar outside. Then she pulled the tall stool from beneath the work table, the stool that had been her mother's stool for 40 years, and she sat down and read it again. The letter was 3 pages long. Estelle had written it in the careful, unhurried hand of someone who had thought carefully about what needed to be said and had decided to say all of it. Not because she was given to long explanations. She had never been given to long explanations, but because she understood that some things, left unsaid, had a way of remaining lost even after everything else had been found. She began with the plants. For 40 years, Estelle had been doing what Vera had never known to call what it was, which was conservation. The Texas Hill Country had been losing its native medicinal plants for decades, losing them to development and land clearing and the slow erasure of the rural communities that had known how to use them and had passed that knowledge from one generation to the next through the specific intimacy of people doing things together in kitchens and gardens and out in the fields. When a family sold their land and moved to the city, the knowledge they carried did not always go with them in any form that survived. It dissolved, the way things dissolve when there is no longer a context to hold them in place. Estelle had understood this earlier than most. She had grown up in the Hill Country in the 1930s and 1940s, in a community where plant knowledge was not an interest or a hobby, but a practical necessity, where the distance to a doctor was measured in half-days of travel, and the women of the community had maintained botanical knowledge that stretched back through generations of Texas families, and before them through traditions older than Texas itself. She had watched that world contract over the course of her adult life, watched the knowledge thin and then disappear community by community as the old ways were displaced by the modern ones, and she had decided, with the characteristic quietness of a woman who acted without announcing her actions, to preserve what she could. She had spent 4 decades collecting. She had driven to old homesteads before demolition, to family farms before sale, to stands of native growth before clearing, and she had collected seeds and cuttings and living plants and brought them back to the 47 acres outside Granger and grown them there with the patient and specific attention of someone who understood that preservation required not just possession but understanding. She had documented everything. The 11 notebooks on the work table were 40 years of records, each plant noted with its common name, its folk name, its botanical name, its known medicinal applications as passed through the communities she had learned from, its growing conditions and harvesting seasons and preparation methods. The sealed jars on the shelves held seeds. Hundreds of seed collections, each one sealed with wax to preserve viability, each one labeled with the plant's identity and the date of collection. Some of them, Estelle wrote, she had been unable to find in the wild for the last decade of her life. The seeds in those jars might be the last viable seeds of those particular varieties anywhere. She had written this without drama. That was the thing about the letter that stayed with Vera longest afterward, the absence of drama in it. Estelle had not written about what she had done as though it were heroic. She had written about it the way she wrote everything, as a plain account of what was true, offered to the person she trusted most to understand it and do something worthy with the understanding. Then she wrote about Vera. She wrote that she had always known her daughter would be the one to find the workshop. Not because she had told her to, she had deliberately not told her, had wanted the finding to happen in its own time and under the right circumstances rather than as a task assigned in advance. She wrote that she had watched Vera her whole life with the particular attention of a mother who understands her child clearly, which is a different and more complicated kind of attention than the attention of a mother who simply loves her child, though it contains that love entirely. She wrote that what she had seen was a woman of extraordinary capability who had spent most of her life applying that capability in service of other people's needs, her employers, her husband's when he was alive, her sons, and who had never quite made the turn toward her own. The land, Estelle wrote, is yours, not as something left over, not as the thing nobody else wanted, as the thing I chose for you specifically because I knew you would understand what it was and what it needed, and because I knew that you would only come to it when you were ready, which means when the other things had run their course. I have thought about you being here alone for a long time. I have thought about you finding this room. I want you to know that I am not sorry you had to wait. Some things can only be received when the person who needs them has become exactly who they need to be to receive them. The last line of the letter read, "The notebooks are yours. The seeds are yours. The land is yours. Now make something of all three that I could not have imagined on my own." Vera sat on her mother's stool in the lamplight for a long time after she finished reading. The wind had settled outside. The cedar was quiet. The hundreds of sealed jars held their contents in the amber glow without comment, patient as they had always been patient, waiting for whatever came next. She did not cry. She had thought she might and was prepared for it, but what she felt was not the kind of thing that required crying. It was larger than that and quieter than that. The specific feeling of being fully known by someone who loved you, which is one of the rarest feelings available to a human being and one of the most sustaining. Her mother had known her, had seen her clearly across 83 years, and had said so in 3 pages of careful handwriting, and had trusted her with 40 years of patient work and 400 sealed jars of seeds that might be the last of their kind. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the inside pocket of her coat, close to her chest. Then she picked up the first notebook and began to read. She read until 2 in the morning. She went inside only when the lantern needed refilling and came back out to the workshop and kept reading, sitting on the stool at her mother's work table with the notebooks open in front of her and the sealed jars all around her, and the night settling into its deepest quiet outside. When she finally went inside and lay down in her sleeping bag, she did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and thought about seeds, about what it meant to preserve something so small for so long against the very reasonable expectation that no one was coming, and to do it anyway. About the specific faith of a person who works for the future without any certainty that the future will receive the work. She called Carol in the morning before he arrived and asked him to add 1 item to the week's work. She needed the workshop cleaned and assessed, and she needed the shelving examined to ensure it was structurally sound. She did not explain why. Carol said he would look at it, and she said thank you and hung up and started coffee. She called Ruth next. Ruth answered on the second ring with the directness Vera had come to expect from her. "I opened the workshop last night," Vera said. There was a brief pause. "And I need you to see it," Vera said. "Come when you can." Ruth came that afternoon. She stood in the workshop doorway for a long moment before stepping inside, reading the room the way she had read the kitchen on her first visit, with the full attention of someone who understood what she was looking at even before she understood what she was looking at. She walked slowly along the shelves, leaning close to read the labels, not touching anything, just reading. She spent a long time at the section of shelves where the oldest jars were, the ones from the late 1950s and early 1960s with their faded labels and their dark wax seals. Then she turned around and looked at Vera. She looked at her for a moment without speaking. "Your mother," she said finally, "was doing something that nobody was paying attention to for 40 years. "I know," Vera said. "Do you know what some of these plants are?" Ruth said. "The ones on these labels?" She paused. "I'm not a botanist, but I know enough to know that some of what she's listed here is not something you can go find anymore. Not easily. Maybe not at all." "She knew," Vera said. "She wrote about it." Ruth was quiet. "Then, what are you going to do with it?" Vera looked at the notebooks stacked on the work table. She looked at the shelves of sealed jars. She thought about her mother's last line. "Make something of all three that I could not have imagined on my own. I'm going to find someone who can tell me exactly what's here," she said. "And then I'm going to figure out how to make it into something that lasts past me." It was Ruth who knew about the university program. She mentioned it the following day, carefully, the way you mention things to someone who you sense needs to arrive at a conclusion themselves rather than be delivered to it. There was a conservation research program at the University Extension in Austin, she said, that specifically worked on native plant preservation in the Edwards Plateau region. She had read about it in a regional newsletter some months back. She believed they had been specifically looking for exactly the kinds of botanical records Estelle had kept, the kind of community-held knowledge that existed nowhere in any formal repository, because the people who had held it had never had reason to write it down for academic audiences. Vera said, "Do you have the newsletter?" Ruth said she thought she did somewhere. She found it. The researcher's name was Dr. Anita Foss, and she was based at the University Extension office in Austin, and had been conducting field research in the hill country for 6 years, working specifically on what the newsletter described as the disappearing ethnobotanical knowledge of rural Texas communities. The medicinal plant traditions that were vanishing as the last generation of people who held them aged out without successors. Vera read the newsletter article twice. Then she wrote a letter. Not an email, a letter, on paper, in her own handwriting. She described the workshop and the notebooks and the seeds and her mother's 40 years of work. She described the property and its history. She included her phone number and her address on the county road outside Granger and mailed it from the post office in town on a Tuesday morning. Dr. Foss called on a Friday. She had the voice of a person who spent most of her time outdoors, clear and direct with none of the careful professional hedging that characterized people whose work happened primarily in institutions. She asked 3 questions in quick succession, where the notebooks in Estelle's own handwriting were the wax seals on the jars intact, and were there any collection records that indicated the original sites where the plants had been sourced? Vera answered yes to all 3. There was a silence on the line. Then Dr. Foss said, "Mrs. Calloway, would it be possible for me to come out to the property next week?" Vera said it would. She came on a Wednesday with a graduate student named Thomas, who was quiet and precise, and carried a field kit with the specific care of someone who understood that what was in it was for looking carefully and not for disturbing. Dr. Foss herself was in her mid-40s with the focused, slightly distracted quality of a researcher whose mind was always working on 2 things simultaneously, the thing in front of her and the thing in front of her implied. Vera walked them through the workshop from the doorway. She did not lead them inside immediately. She stood in the doorway and described what they were looking at and let them see it first before they approached it, the way her mother had granted access to this room, deliberately and accompanied. Dr. Foss stood at the threshold and looked at the shelves of sealed jars and did not say anything for a full minute. Thomas had stopped writing in his notebook. Then Dr. Foss turned to Vera. She said, "I need you to understand something before we go any further. What you have here, if it is what these labels suggest, is not simply a collection of botanical specimens. It is a primary ethnobotanical archive, one of the most significant private collections of indigenous medicinal plant material from this region that I am aware of existing anywhere." She paused. "I have been looking for collections like this for 6 years. I have found fragments, partial records, single-family collections with a few dozen samples." She looked at the shelves. "This is not a fragment." Vera said, "My mother was not a woman who did things partially. They spent 4 hours in the workshop that day." Dr. Foss examined the notebooks with the reverence of someone handling something they had spent years believing might not exist. She cross-referenced labels against her own field records, pulling up data on her phone, comparing what Estelle had documented against the regional distribution maps she had been building across 6 years of field work. 3 times she stopped and asked Thomas to photograph a specific label or a specific notebook page. Each time she did it with the contained precision of someone who was managing a very strong reaction carefully. At the kitchen table afterward, with tea, she told Vera what she had found. Or the beginning of what she had found, she was careful to say, because the full assessment would require weeks of careful work. But the beginning was this. Of the seed collections she had been able to preliminarily identify from the labels, at least 14 represented plant varieties that had no known living population in the wild in the current regional surveys. 11 more represented varieties whose wild populations were critically reduced, documented at fewer than 5 known sites in the entire Edwards Plateau region. Estelle had collected the seeds of these plants at a time when they had still existed in sufficient numbers to yield viable seed, had sealed them with a method that had clearly preserved their viability, and had kept them in conditions stable enough, cool and dry and dark, to maintain that viability across more than 2 decades. She said this plainly. Then she said, "If these seeds germinate at a reasonable rate, and the conditions of their storage suggest they may, this collection represents a restoration opportunity that the conservation community in this region has not had access to. There are plants in those jars that we had effectively written off." Vera looked at her. Written off meaning we believed restoration was no longer possible in any meaningful time frame, that the window had closed. She met Vera's eyes. "Your mother kept the window open." The verification process began the following month and moved with the careful, thorough pace of work that understood its own significance and did not rush it. Dr. Foss returned with a larger team, 2 additional researchers and 3 graduate students, and they worked through the workshop methodically over 2 consecutive weekends, cataloging every jar, cross-referencing every label against the notebooks, beginning the careful process of germination testing on small samples from the seed collections to assess viability. Carol had reinforced the workshop shelving and installed proper temperature regulation at Vera's request, a small climate control unit that maintained the cool, stable conditions the seeds required. He had done it with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, asking only what she needed the temperature maintained at, accepting her answer without question. The germination results came in over 6 weeks. 83% of the samples tested showed viable germination. It was, Dr. Foss told her on the phone with a steadiness in her voice that Vera understood was the steadiness of someone containing a significant reaction, well above any expectation they had modeled before testing. The seeds had been sealed at the right moment, in the right conditions, by a woman who had understood precisely what she was doing. The University Extension announced a formal partnership with the Callaway property in January. The announcement generated coverage in 2 regional publications, and then, unexpectedly, in a national conservation journal that ran a short piece about Estelle's work under the heading of Community-Based Conservation, the unrecognized contributions of rural women to the preservation of ecological knowledge. The piece named Estelle Callaway by name. It named the property. It named Vera as the preservation and restoration lead. Dale called the evening the Conservation Journal piece ran. He had found it online. He was quiet on the phone in the way he had been quiet. Standing in the yard looking at the workshop, the quiet of a man recalibrating his understanding of something he had thought he understood. "Mom," he said, "this is extraordinary." "It was your grandmother," Vera said. "I'm just the one who opened the door." He was quiet again. "Then, I want to come out. If that's all right. I want to bring the kids. I want them to see this." Vera looked through the kitchen window at the workshop, its door open now in the daytime, the organized interior visible from where she stood, the shelves of sealed jars catching the winter light. "Come in spring," she said, "when the first germinations are going into the ground. That's the right time to see it." He said he would. She believed him. The karma arrived in the way karma tends to arrive in real life, not with a dramatic scene, but with a phone call and a silence. Sheila called on a Thursday afternoon in February, which Vera had not expected, Sheila having always been a woman who managed her communications with deliberate selectivity. She had read the Conservation Journal piece, she said. She had also seen the follow-up piece in the Texas Regional magazine that had run a longer profile of the property and of Vera specifically, with photographs of the workshop and the shelves and the notebooks, and Vera herself standing at the work table in the amber light of the lantern, one hand on the open notebook, looking at something off-camera that the photographer had said, afterward, was exactly the right expression for the photograph. Sheila said, "I owe you an apology." She said it without preparation or softening. "I was part of a decision that treated you as less than you are. I understood that at the time and I did it anyway because it was easier than the alternative. That was wrong." Vera was quiet for a moment. She looked at the photograph of Estelle on the mantel. She thought about what her mother had written. "I have thought about you being here alone for a long time. I want you to know that I am not sorry you had to wait." "Sheila," she said, "you gave me the push I needed. I won't tell you it didn't hurt, because it did. But I am sitting in my mother's kitchen on my own land with work that matters, and I don't know that I would have arrived here any other way." She paused. "So I accept your apology, and I want you to know that what's been done is done, and what matters now is what comes next." Sheila was quiet for long enough that Vera could hear her composing herself on the other end of the line. Then she said, "Thank you." She said it simply, and Vera could hear that she meant it fully. By spring, the first beds were going in on the south side of the property, laid out according to the maps Estelle had drawn in the 5th notebook, precise hand-drawn diagrams of where each plant had originally grown and what it had grown beside and what conditions it had preferred. Dr. Foss's graduate students worked alongside Ruth and Carol's wife, a woman named Pauline who had arrived one Saturday in March and simply started working without being asked and had not stopped coming since. Dale and his 2 teenagers arrived on the first Saturday of April as he had promised, and Vera watched her grandchildren kneel in the soil of their great-grandmother's garden and place seeds into the ground with careful hands, and she felt something complete itself in her chest, a long sentence that Estelle had begun in 1958 and that was only now reaching its end. The property became, over that spring and into summer, the thing her mother had worked toward without naming. A living archive. A place where knowledge that had been on the edge of permanent loss was now rooted in soil and documented in databases and taught to graduate students, and to a 16-year-old named Clara, who had her great-great-grandmother Estelle's eyes, and who had asked, on her third visit to the property, if she could come back in the summer and help with the harvest documentation. Vera said yes immediately. She was 83 years old. Her hands shook sometimes with the tremor that had come and not entirely gone. She moved at the pace the work required and no faster, and she rested when her body told her to rest, and she did not apologize for any of it. She woke every morning to work that was exactly hers. Work that had been preserved for her across 22 years of waiting by a mother who had understood her better than she had understood herself, and she went to bed every night with the particular exhaustion of a person who has used the day fully and wasted none of it. On a morning in late May, she walked to the workshop before breakfast, the way she had made a habit of doing, not because she needed to check on it, but because she liked to begin the day there, in the room where her mother had worked for 40 years and where the work was still continuing in forms Estelle had not quite been able to imagine. She stood in the doorway in the early light and looked at the shelves that were half empty now, the seeds that had been in those jars moving into the ground, and into university greenhouses, and into the hands of other conservationists in other parts of the state who were beginning their own restoration work with materials that would not have existed without Estelle's long and unrecognized patience. She thought about the nursing home brochures on Dale's kitchen table, the Tai Chi photographs and the soft lighting and the scheduled meal times. She thought about Meadow Crest Senior Living and the common room and the bridge club and the white-haired people smiling for a camera on behalf of a version of the end of life that had nothing to do with her. She thought about being 83 and standing in a doorway in the May morning with 47 acres behind her and 11 notebooks on the work table beside her and seeds going into the ground all across the south garden, seeds that had waited 22 years for her to be ready to receive them. She thought about her mother's last line, "Make something of all three that I could not have imagined on my own." She put on her gardening gloves. She went to work. There are things the world decides to seal away, not out of malice, but out of the short-sightedness of people moving too quickly to look carefully at what they are passing. And there are women who are handed keys to locked rooms and carry those keys for years without knowing why, and who arrive at the door only when they have become exactly who they needed to be to open it. The door Vera Calloway opened was her mother's, but what waited behind it had always been hers. It had simply been waiting, the way the best things wait, patient and sealed and entirely certain that the right person was coming. She was 83 years old. She had never been more fully herself. She had never been more alive. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.